Today we're going to be talking about some really interesting ESG issues in Australia that are important for companies that are carrying on business in Australia and anyone that's looking to invest in Australia. We're going to have a conversation amongst the three of us. We have at the other end there Claire Smith, who's our National Practice Group Leader of our Environmental and Sustainability Practice, Emily Tranter, a Commercial Litigation Partner, and I'm a Competition Partner. I'm going to start with what the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, is interested in relative to ESG. Energy transition is one of the most important priorities for the ACCC. And I want to talk about two areas that the ACCC is currently focusing on that you and everyone else might be interested in. The first is sustainability as a public benefit. Broadly speaking, the ACCC can authorise conduct, including mergers, applying a net public benefit test. And environmental benefits have for a long time been included as a public benefit when people are seeking to have conduct authorised under that test. The ACCC recently authorised the Brookfield acquisition of Origin Energy that I think everyone here was following pretty closely and probably followed closely overseas. And the ACCC authorised that transaction on the basis that the ACCC concluded that it would result in a public benefit that would outweigh a public detriment. For the competition lawyers in the audience, the competition concern the ACCC identified was competitive effects of vertical integration between electricity transmission and generation, but we're not going to talk about that today. But the ACCC was satisfied that there was a public benefit arising from the acquisition, which was the acceleration of renewable generation and storage built out in Australia, resulting in a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, which the ACCC would have thought would occur more quickly with the acquisition than without the acquisition. And the ACCC concluded this was a material public benefit in the sense that it would be important and of value to Australians, help Australia mitigate its contribution to climate change and assist in meeting or exceeding national emissions reductions targets, and also contributed to supporting a global transition to lower emissions. So Australia and global, which is interesting. I think this is one of the rare instances where we've seen the ACCC authorising conduct on the basis of sustainability benefits amounting to material public benefits. And I think it underscores the importance the ACCC places on rapidly advancing renewable energy generation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I reckon the takeout from that is that we're likely to see more sustainability or climate-based submissions for public benefits in authorisation applications following this decision. So that's super interesting to competition lawyers and also interesting to people who are looking to make acquisitions in Australia and going down the authorisation path. The second thing the ACCC is looking at is greenwashing, which I know you two have a really close interest in that you'll talk about in a sec. The ACCC has recently published some very detailed draft guidelines on what the ACCC thinks is best practice when making environmental and sustainability claims. And I do think the guidelines are well worth reading. They include some really good and detailed case studies. For example, what the ACCC considers to be good practice in making claims about sustainability transition, and particularly if you're going to be making public statements about emissions reduction goals. And the ACCC's case study focuses, I think this is quite interesting, focuses on a whole range of matters, but including if you're purchasing offsets, not just that you're purchasing offsets, but the quality of those offsets. And there's an emphasis on the integrity of those offsets, which I think is very interesting and probably in line with some of the trends that you're both seeing, which maybe Emily, do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, I'd love to. Look, I'd love to talk about what we're seeing particularly with our other regulator, which is ASIC in Australia, who's really been at the forefront of probably a lot of greenwashing regulatory action over the last particularly 12 months. We've seen the pendulum really swing from consultation and guidance to well and truly enforcement. So at the moment, they've issued approximately 20 infringement notices and commenced 3 civil penalty proceedings, which is quite substantial. And I think from that sort of body of work, the 3 take-homes or the three emerging issues that we've seen developed are really, the first is a developing sophistication on sustainable taxonomy. And I think that's really important because the language that particularly funds and superannuation funds have been using has been targeted by ASIC. We're seeing a lot of development within that space in Australia with other organisations, and being careful about how you describe things, not just green and clean, but also ethical investments. And ASIC's been very strong in saying greenwashing covers more than just climate-related issues. It involves whether you're targeting or not targeting, for example, tobacco, gambling industries and the like. They've also been very strong in saying it's what you don't say. So the green hushing side of things, representations by emissions, are also being a focus. So the second big focus has really been on sustainable finance itself and the how of how you do sustainable finance. So looking at particularly the safeguards, the procedures, ASIC is really coming under the curtain to look at the positive and negative screenings that fund managers are claiming to be using to support their claims. Interesting, and I think emerging from that, is that they're not only looking at what the fund managers are doing, but they're also looking at what third parties are doing to support those fund managers. So interrogating, Claire, like the ESG credentials that we're seeing, what's being done, the veracity of that interrogation, but also the value chains that we've spoken a lot about, which is what is the organisation or the investment target itself doing, but what are the wholly owned subsidiaries doing as well. And I think the third really emerging strong point from the ASIC regulatory space is the broader ESG disclosures and how that is interconnected with the very emerging and very strong shareholder activism in Australia. Australia was really the first jurisdiction for a shareholder action to commence in relation to greenwashing against an energy company, and Claire might talk more about that shortly. But what it really is, I think, for ASIC is that they will be starting to dive deeper off the back of that activism to look at examples of claims for net zero claims and emissions, the veracity of offset targets and use of those, to really understand the technology behind those claims. So that's sort of three snapshot areas, I think, for ASIC, what we're looking for in the coming sort of 12 months.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm going to talk, my focus is technical. So I'm going to draw on actually both your themes, and I have been assisting you both from a purely technical perspective with some of the regulatory matters you've both been doing. On the offset side of things, the reason that the regulators are interrogating the offsets is actually because of a whistleblower complaint last year. And here in Australia, we have carbon farming offsets that relate to, they call it human-induced regeneration, but areas that you don't clear. So there was a big whistleblowing investigation in relation to that. Then there was a review, and there's pros and cons of that, I would say, as an environmental lawyer. For those that are providing credits in the market, it was a concern for them because the price of carbon dropped as a result of that. For those, however, that are investing and trying to avoid greenwashing claims, it was important. You need to ensure you have high integrity carbon offset markets, because if you're going to be relying on that information in your disclosures, you could get caught up in misleading claims, which actually the federal government's Climate Active Fund got caught up in that last year. It's the first thing. Second thing that's been very interesting here in Australia is the discussion around misleading greenwashing claims in relation to statements that have been made in decarbonisation plans and annual reports about your progress to your short, medium and long-term targets towards net zero and what's meant, for example, by clean energy. So you mentioned that case. One of the points that's being argued in that case is whether gas is a clean energy, and the activist is arguing it isn't, because it does produce obviously quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well. Another point in that case is around blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen that where you produce it from, for example, gas, but then you store the carbon in underground geological formations. So it's something called carbon capture storage. Again, the allegation is it's misleading to include blue hydrogen in your net zero claims because the cost currently of complying with or putting a carbon capture storage project in place, and B, still some uncertainties about the technology and where that goes. And also the fact that on the one hand you're claiming net zero when on the same side you're using a technology to actually increase your emissions. Which brings me to my next point, which is really all around the financial institutions. So you referred to value chains. I've been looking at it in a slightly different perspective from financial institutions and who they lend to. And there is all of the big five banks here have been reporting against something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's now been wrapped up into international standards, which we go global, so taxonomy is hugely important. At the moment, though, there is opportunity for activists to raise greenwashing issues because you don't have that taxonomy, you don't yet have mandatory climate reporting, although you will here in Australia next year. And as a result of that, banks are being pulled into the greenwashing arena, partly because the activists are saying they're not truly disclosing their impact on climate because they're not disclosing their off-balance sheet investments, and partly because of how they report against their emissions, whether they're reporting the absolute emissions of what they're investing in or the emissions intensity, which again, like blue hydrogen, allows them to actually invest in projects where the emissions are increasing. So the last thing I want to talk about is a topic that's very dear to me that I've been following for the last 6 months, and that's natural capital and nature-related disclosures. And in September this year in New York, they finalised the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, and it is something to look out for in the greenwashing space because globally, a lot of large corporates and also a lot of global and here our local banks will be reporting against TNFD over the course of the coming year. It is complicated. It takes into account upstream and downstream value chains. Nature, unlike carbon, is location specific, and the corporates and the banks will need to be careful in terms of what they say to avoid potentially misleading conduct. So I just hand back to you, Emily.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks, Kirsten. I think what's clear from the discussion today is that ESG, the energy transition and greenwashing are very interconnected here in Australia, like they are in all parts of the world at the moment. We're quite unique because we have a high regulatory activity in Australian jurisdiction, also coupled with a very high activist shareholder market. So they're very interesting areas of developing of law that's continuing to develop very quickly, and very important to be aware of these developments if you're doing business here in Australia.